Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Government Guidebook Release webinar. My name is Rajini Menon. I'm the Civic Inclusion Manager at the Women's Fund. The Government Guidebook was created a few years ago as a resource for elected officials to make it easier for them to appoint more women. This happened much before I started in this role, but it was put on the back burner because of a lot of other competing priorities and, of course, COVID. Holly Hankinson, our advocacy director, led this initiative at that time. And I'm thrilled that we now officially have an opportunity to officially launch the guidebook. I shall turn it over to Holly to present the guidebook to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rajini. As Rajini mentioned, we are very excited to be able to release this guidebook today. So I'm going to go through sort of an introduction on the background and then share a little bit of how the guidebook works in this presentation. So as Rajini mentioned, this is really closely connected with our appointed initiative, which many people here are familiar with. This is our initiative to increase the number of women on civic boards throughout our region. When we launched Appointed, it was started in 2018, and we had heard about a similar initiative happening in Kansas City, actually, and that's sort of what gave us the idea to start this work here. This was the first time that the Women's Fund had really thought about these boards and commissions, in our region. We knew sort of generally what they were. We had heard of the Zoning Commission and the Health Board, but we really hadn't thought about them as a collective opportunity to be involved in public service. And when we realized, as we were learning about these boards, we realized really quickly that they're a really important part of the way our governments work. And so we wanted to highlight them to our community so they could learn a little bit more about these governments, these boards as well. So the basic premise of Appointed is that governments should represent the communities they serve. And these boards and commissions are the foundation of that. So, as I mentioned, we launched Appointed in 2018. We started introducing this idea of Appointed to elected officials and sort of administrative officials throughout our region as sort of a first start. So we met with larger governments, the city of Cincinnati, Hamilton County, and then some smaller ones as well. We met with Liberty Township, Westchester, the city of Covington, sort of these smaller regional governments as well. And when we launched this, we weren't quite sure how governments were going to respond to this idea of Appointed. We were a little bit nervous about, how this might be a partisan issue. We weren't really sure, how people were going to respond. And we were a little bit surprised, pleasantly so, as we talked to sort of elected officials from both sides of the aisle and administrative officials around the region, that this really seemed to be a very nonpartisan issue. People were really receptive to the idea of increasing civic engagement generally and increasing the number of women on their boards. And although we found sort of a general desire to increase diversity and citizen engagement from these government officials and to find more candidates in general, in particular women and people of color, a lot of the governments didn't really seem to have a clear idea of how to get started. We were sort of building it as the plane as we were flying it, and a lot of governments sort of said, we want to have more people involved in government. We just aren't quite sure how to do that. And it seemed from talking to these officials that the majority of the time it was sort of a capacity issue. They really posted the position sometimes on these boards. Sometimes it was word of mouth. They might have done a little recruiting here and there, but they really didn't have structures in place to do more than that. So, we realized that although Appointed's sort of focus is increasing the number of women on civic boards, we really realized we couldn't do it alone. And governments sort of have an interest and a responsibility to provide this broader citizen engagement. And we wanted to be part of that solution. So early on, a few specific issues with the current systems started to emerge. One of our first meetings when we were talking about Appointed was with Hamilton County, in particular with Hamilton County Commissioner Denise Driehaus. She was one of our very first Appointed meetings. And, as we talked about this idea, she was really receptive. And her first reaction was one of the challenges they had at the county with their own board application. I have it here. I know you can't read it. It's really small, but I can say that this is a PDF. It's meant to be handwritten. And then the request is to fax it in after you're done filling out the applications. So that is sort of the first challenge with this, right? I know a lot of people, especially younger people, my own kids have never even heard of a fax machine. I haven't seen one personally in years. I wouldn't even know where to get started. And so this application, that's the way, the primary way to turn it in is by fax. There's an email address buried on the website, I think, is another option, which probably ends up being the way that people maybe end up doing it, but they have to dig around to find it. The questions themselves on this application are pretty vague, and they're beyond things that are relevant to the board. There's questions like if there's anything in your past that might reflect poorly on the county, whether you have any ethical breaches, whether there's child support payments that are overdue. It asks about campaign contributions, which is interesting. This is a county board. It's hard to know if this is something that's expected or not expected. Is this positive or negative? So there's a lot of things on here that, not to sort of shame, any government at all. It's just, a lot of people didn't know why these questions were asked. And they're not really relevant. They weren't really relevant to finding qualified board candidates. So when we were talking to Commissioner Drioche, she recognized this was a challenge and admitted that they didn't really have the capacity or the time to really address this within their office. They had a lot of other competing priorities, obviously, at the county. So another challenge that we identified, early on was emerging issues when we were talking to female board candidates themselves. So when we launched Appointed, we also interviewed a number of women who are serving on civic boards about their experiences with the boards. And they were really vocal about some of the challenges that they faced, as board members and with the process to becoming a board member. So one of the barriers that they mentioned was this idea of walking into that first meeting and just not really knowing what was going on. It took months sometimes to get up to speed on the particular board and the jargon and the board specifics. And they kind of vocalized that there just weren't a lot of people. There wasn't any training. There wasn't any sort of orientation to the board. So they had to kind of come in and figure it out on the fly. They also shared that, it was really important, especially, as a woman, to make a strong first impression as a new board member. That first impression, especially when you might be representing, someone for, being representing your sort of gender or for the first time on that board, you want to make a strong first impression as a new member. And they just shared that's really challenging to do if you're not informed, on what's going on, and you aren't really given information on what's going on. So we started to consider all of these learnings together and realize that it's not just an issue of individual board seats. There's something more here. We wanted to help create this systemic solution. So a few kind of things we were thinking about here. First, we recognize that the status quo has some flaws in it. So the systems that are currently in place really only work for individuals who already fit into and understand this world of government and politics. The system is inherently biased against people with lived experience who might not be used to navigating fundraisers or professional networking events on their regular basis. We also realized that Appointed is only one part of the solution. We love our initiative and we want to educate and recruit individuals into the current system, and that's super important work, but it really only gets us partway there. So we started to think, how can we broaden this initiative and address it more systemically? We needed to start looking at how to make the broader systems more inclusive and accessible from the government side. And we knew from our government conversations that there is some level of interest in doing this. So our solution was to create an easy sort of how-to manual to help these governments make their boards more inclusive, which ended up, resulting in the Government Guidebook that we're releasing today. So I want to talk a little bit on how we did this. What was our approach to this guidebook? It's important to see for us that the work, is both really grounded in our research, which is a core of how we do our work at the Women's Fund. And it also includes some pretty broad input because that was also really important to us to get the input of others. So we started out with our research, as we do with many things at the Women's Fund. We got our research committee involved, and they began reviewing municipalities across the country, looking at best practices. They looked at everything different cities and governments were doing. They looked at websites, job postings, how they provided training, what information was publicly available. They also started looking at organizations that focus on this similar type of work. There aren't a ton of organizations that are doing this, but there are a few others. And they came up with a really comprehensive list of recommendations and places that were doing it really well. We had a huge list of ideas that allowed us to be really thorough and create sort of this robust how-to manual. Then we got our advocacy committee involved, and they started to categorize and sort of bucket this information. And they started to look at these recommendations and prioritize them based on how much of an impact they would make. We also thought about things like the cost of the recommendations, how much staff time it would take to implement, things like that. Then we decided, we had to focus obviously on the design and the development of the guidebook itself. We really wanted the guidebook to look good. It'd be easy to read and understand. The government officials that are looking at this are very busy and they have a lot going on. So we wanted to make it something that was pretty clear how it worked, just based on the design of it. We also were very fortunate that we had a volunteer web developer who was able to create wireframes specifically for our website recommendations so that governments could take the sort of the recommendation from the guidebook and personalize them based on sort of their branding and plug it into their own web pages directly, to make it really easy. And finally, we needed to vet the documents. So we went through a final vetting process with our committee and a stakeholder group of government officials and people with government experience to review it and provide feedback as well. So we had some broad sort of goals for the guidebook as we were getting started. First, as I mentioned, we needed it to be clear, attractive, and easy to follow visually. We also really wanted it to be easy to implement. We wanted it to be something that can work within an existing government system. Every government has their own way of doing things. We wanted to be able to plug this in, to whatever they're already doing for their board and commission recruiting. We also wanted to provide it so make it so the governments could really go big with a complete overhaul of their system, of their board and commission and civic engagement systems, or make it so they could start with sort of smaller, more incremental changes if that is what works best for them. And finally, we needed to make it fit to audiences. We wanted it to make it relevant to the decision makers, who are usually elected officials, who can really sort of see the value of this project and sort of prioritize this within their governments. We also needed it to be clear and accessible for the government employees and administrators who are working to implement the changes sort of from an administrative standpoint. So next I want to go through some of the highlights of the guidebook itself. This is sort of the cover. It's the Government Guidebook for Board and Commission Inclusion. So a couple of themes are in the guidebook that surfaced sort of as we were going through the recommendation. So these are some of the high-level themes that can really be viewed as a lens when reviewing and making adjustments to government policies in general to make them more inclusive. So the first theme in the guidebook is meeting people where they are. So this means sort of actually physically meeting people where they are. So making sure that government is available in communities and places where people already are. And also digitally, meeting people sort of where they are online through things like making applications simple and making websites mobile friendly, making government really easy to access. The second theme is making people feel welcome and included. People really need to feel invited to the table to participate in government. So things like using welcoming and inclusive language is really important, and following up with that, this welcoming actions and inclusion. Third is removing barriers to participation. So often, individuals want to participate in government, but they might have barriers such as work schedules, childcare, or other barriers that make it difficult to engage. So there are a lot of recommendations around things like holding meetings in the community, changing the meetings times to make it not interfere with traditional working times. Consider access to public transportation, those sort of barriers. And the final theme is creating tools for accountability. Government, like every organization, they have mounting demands on their time and resources. So most organizations prioritize what they measure. That's what we all do it. The things that we're accountable to, the things that we're tracking and measuring, are the things that we're going to prioritize. So that's really important here. It's really important to be public about the intention to do this work, set clear goals, and create sort of internal accountability measurements to ensure that this work remains a priority. So the guidebook is organized into 3 main sections. The first is getting started. It outlines a few preliminary steps governments can take to set themselves up for success. The second is a list of the recommendations themselves. We have sort of 5 broad topic areas that we bucket the recommendations into. So the first is websites. We have the application process, marketing and outreach, trainings, and transparency and good government. And then the final section of the guidebook are the resources. This is a pretty robust appendix that includes links to best-in-class examples of places that are doing a great job. We have templates and toolkits to help with the implementation. So I'm not going to go through all of the recommendation sections, but I want to highlight a few just to sort of share the look and feel of the guidebook. First, this is one of the sections on the websites. So making the government websites clear and accessible is really important. So most governments have some sort of website for their board, but sometimes it's hard to find, and it doesn't often have a lot of information about what the boards do and how they operate. Sometimes it's a 1-sentence description or things that are a little bit irrelevant to most people, like the state ordinance that creates the board. I mean, that's really interesting, and it might not provide a lot of context about how the board operates. So this is sort of our sort of vision of what a website would look like for an individual board. So this is our section for any town USA. That's sort of our town that we're using in our guidebook. So you can see the top shows the actual example page. This is what the website could look like itself. And then it has orange dots on it, which correspond to the recommendations, which are on sort of the next page, that describes what each part of the website looks like and why. So you can see, again, this is pretty small, I'm sure, but that we'll have, it's in the guidebook itself, so you can check it out there. But you can see the number 3 section recommends including detailed board information in the guidebook. So you can see that and the corresponding 3 on the page itself has links to agendas, the board information, that sort of thing. So all of our recommendations in the whole guidebook are meant to be implemented in a way that works best for the government structure, but some recommendations sort of naturally have a bigger impact on inclusion than others. And so we show this prioritization in the book by indicating which recommendations could be implemented now, next, or later. So I mentioned earlier that we had a volunteer developer create the wireframes for the websites. The sample websites that she created is actually based on this design. So if a government wanted to sort of use the guidebook and plug the guidebook sections right into their website, they can just take the code for this, change the colors, add their logo, and plug it right into their own website. So earlier I mentioned the application challenges that Hamilton County faced at the beginning when we were starting this conversation. We provide an entire section in the guidebook around how to improve the application and application process. So our sample application has really clear, simple questions for candidates and requesting voluntary demographic information. So we believe that's really important as well. We also have recommendations regarding sort of not just the actual application, but the process. So, our guidebook recommends that the application is available online and accessible on a cell phone, a mobile format as well. We also recommend that governments consider holding their applications open for a particular board until they receive a diverse slate of candidates to consider. And in the appendix to the guidebook, there are templates for applications for sort of short form applications, if you just want to ask a couple questions, to longer form board applications as well. So we have a few different formats. And finally, I want to highlight our section on training. So as we knew from our interviews with board members, this is a really key issue. One of the recommendations includes holding board orientations and developing a handbook for new board members for every board, and creating equity-focused trainings for all board members. And again, we have in the appendix, the corresponding appendix section for the training, we have a detailed list of training resources and some specific topic areas that could be covered. This is an area that actually a number of governments that we talk to have really been interested in figuring out how to provide more training to the work of their current boards. At the end of the guidebook, we have all of the recommendations included in one chart. We talked about that sort of now, next, later prioritization that is also included here. And we also have some practical information on these recommendations that a lot of governments would care about as well. So we have looked at the staffing levels for each recommendation and sort of how much staff would be required to implement the change. We also have whether the item is a one-time change, or it will require sort of ongoing maintenance to keep the recommendation going. And then finally, we have a sort of generalized cost. So not the dollar amount, but sort of whether it's a high, medium, or low cost recommendation to implement. And then finally, this is an example of the appendix section of the guidebook. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of tools and best practices in the appendix, and we try to make it engaging where we can. So these two pages are examples of sort of how, well, the first one is an area to brainstorm organizations for marketing board opportunities. So when we think about outreach, for these board openings, we have a list of organizations that the governments could reach out to start to advertise their board vacancies. And we also have links to best practices, sort of other cities that are doing this work really well. So this example here shows Austin, Texas's online training program. They have a really wonderful online training available for their board members. So that is the guidebook. As Rajni mentioned earlier, this has been a while coming, a long time coming, and so we're really excited to release it here today. It is currently available on our website, on the Women's Fund's website, and I think we can put a link in the chat here and then share that out as well after this is over. The link to the guidebook there. And then, this is a resource for our governments and administrations around the region. We want to spread it to as many governments as possible. So please share with anyone who you think might be interested in. We're also available as a resource to answer questions and discuss sort of how it might work best within any individual government. So I want to open it up. I don't know if there are any questions. I can't see the chat, unfortunately. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat. No. All right. Well, thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Rajni.
Thank you, Holly. That was great. And again, I'm thrilled that we have finally launched this guidebook officially. I put the link on the chat, but I did not open it up to everybody. Then I think Melissa has just posted it again. So now everyone has the link. It's on our website on the appointed page. If you have questions, you all know how to get hold of me. Just email me or call me if you have any questions, or if there's someone we can share this with. Okay, so thanks again for attending this afternoon, and I wish you a very good day. Bye.